And the one thing that we learned about God that was paramount above all others is that he only works by love. That's where our agency comes directly into play. We choose how we respond to that love and how we emulate that love. Identity is always a work in progress, and we are always in a position to be making choices about the kind of identity we want to create. I think that agency is about acquiring greater individuality and differentiation, not greater commonality.
There's a lot more it mattereth not sometimes than we give it credit for.
I don't think it's about getting the script right. I think God gives us a blank canvas and says, here, paint a beautiful picture.
Welcome to Out of the Best Books, where we pull a book from the Desert Book Library and we let it kick off thoughtful conversations. I'm Sarah Collins.
And I'm Cole Wissinger, and we are part of Deseret Books' podcast team. The quest for an understanding of agency isn't limited to the Latter-day Saint branch of Christianity or believers in God or any subsection of thinkers. It's a core foundation of philosophy and theology throughout human existence. And we aren't going to solve it in the next 30 minutes either. But for those looking for an accessible look at how understanding agency can build your testimony of the divine, we have a gospel scholar with us to help learn more.
Terryl Givens is a research fellow from the Maxwell Institute and an accomplished author of many books, some co-authored with his wife Fiona, and he is the writer of the next book we're looking at today, which is Agency, Themes in the Doctrine and Covenants. Hi, Terryl. How are you today?
Doing well, thanks. Good to be here.
So good to have you.
Before we flesh out the complicated human understanding of agency, why do you think? We've kind of set up this series before, how there are these different themes in the Doctrine and Covenants that different scholars and authors have been able to tackle. And we've covered a few in episodes past, and we'll have a few more before 2025 is over. But were you, in that process, did you pick agency? Why do you think that agency is a thing that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I chose agency, and maybe it was just self-indulgence, but...
That's good. You're an author.
I've been interested in agency for a couple of reasons. One is because it was so clearly central in the thought of Joseph Smith, central in Latter-day Saint cosmology in a way that it isn't as central in other faith traditions. In fact, much of the Catholic and Protestant worlds historically have been hesitant to embrace, what's called libertarian free will.
Yeah.
Because there's always been the fear that it doesn't quite accommodate the full sovereignty of God. And so it's always been a contentious issue in religious thought. But, the very, very first hymn in the Latter-day Saint collection of hymns was, "Know this, that every soul is free." Joseph Smith really reinvents a new cosmology when he makes agency rather than good and evil the focus of the war in heaven. And one commentator has referred to Mormons as having an obsessive preoccupation with agency. And then I think most recently, my son Nathaniel and I wrote a book for Erdman's called Into the Headwinds. And it was an attempt to try to situate religious struggle in the contemporary context of new or kind of cutting edge thinking about psychology and sociology and evolution. And so agency comes up there again as a central preoccupation. So it seemed the right time to devote a little book on the subject, which I did.
Right. When you say that it's maybe something evangelical Christians or other Christians sometimes stay away from or don't want to dive too deeply in, can you tell me more about that? My assumption is that will undo the principle of an omnipotent God.
Well, in some ways, free will comes into conflict with omnipotence, yes, and omniscience, both. In the case of omnipotence, if God is thought to be sovereign, that is taken, like in the Westminster Confession, sovereignty is defined as God being the source of everything that is, and it defines everything that exists as a direct product of his will. He ordains everything that comes to pass. Well, if he ordained it that I would have a cheeseburger tonight instead of pizza, then I don't have any free will in the matter. So that's the problem of omnipotence and agency. But it has been argued as well, and the arguments can get rather complex. But if God knows the future, then that means that I don't have freedom to choose the future. And just to give a specific argument for why this is plausibly the case, if he knows that I'm going to have a cheeseburger, he knows it not just because he can see the future, presumably, but he has to know the principles on the basis of which that eventuality will follow ineluctably given the present circumstances and factors at work. And so that would mean that something is determining my behavior. So this point of view really comes into full fruition in the Christian tradition in the early 5th century, in the debates between Augustine and Pelagius. And this is where Augustine fully enunciates a doctrine of original sin. Original sin is defined by him or characterized by him as entailing the destruction of libertarian freedom, as we would describe that. So in what philosophers and theologians call the compatibilist argument, compatibilism meaning that they're trying to find a place for freedom alongside of God's sovereignty. And so freedom ends up being defined as freedom to do evil, but not freedom to do good.
Oh, interesting.
So I think that's a pretty lame and kind of vacuous conception of freedom. We're free to sin, but we're not free to do anything good unless God predisposes us and enables us to do good. So that's the official doctrine underlying most Protestant and Catholic conceptions of human agency.
So let's kind of stick there. We're a little bit pre-Joseph Smith. We're talking about the 5th century right now, but then what does Christianity get to by the time we get to the 19th century that made what is in the Doctrine and Covenants now so radical in some places that kind of reframes what agency can be?
Yeah, superb question. So I would take us to the Joseph Smith's account of his first vision, the Joseph Smith story.
Great place to start.
And where he gives the background. Remember that he's characterizing the religious environment in America as essentially a contest between Presbyterians and Methodists. There are other denominations too, but those are the two most contending for his religious commitment. And of course, the principal difference between the Presbyterians and the Methodists is that the Presbyterians come out of the Calvinist tradition, and so they are pretty hardcore determinists. The Methodists have broken with mainstream Protestantism by embracing a strain of thought called Arminianism. And Jacob Arminius was a theologian who tried to make more space for human choice. And his argument was that we depend upon God's grace, but we are free to choose to accept that or to reject that grace. And Joseph, of course, embraces the Methodist faith, I think principally for that reason, but then he pushes the role of agency far beyond anything that Jacob Arminius had in mind. Because for Jacob Arminius, God still has to empower our choices. He still has to enable us to do anything good. Whereas for Joseph Smith, for Latter-day Saint theology, I think there's a much greater ambit for human initiative and human striving.
Okay, interesting. So where does becoming conscious of our agency play a role into how we can build a relationship with God, I guess, as it's become an important thing to study and take out of the Doctrine and Covenants and also see it throughout Scripture? So what then, right? Like why need to know about it?
No, I think that's a great question. I think what you're asking is, okay, so where does the rubber meet the road?
Yeah, yes.
Does have to do with lived Christianity, with practical Christianity. And here I just choose as my point of orientation a statement that Joseph made that I think is much more philosophically rich than we've recognized. Joseph once said that every soul that God sent into the world is susceptible of enlargement. I work with that language that he uses. I think there's a really interesting feature of that phrasing insofar as he doesn't say capable of but we're susceptible of enlargement. So I've explored that idea in this study of agency, and I think there's evidence in the Doctrine and Covenants that underlying the LDS conception of discipleship is the recognition that agency always works in a field of agents. We are always being acted upon by ideas, by examples, by influences, by words. And we are susceptible, meaning that we are vulnerable to these influences. And so much of the Doctrine and Covenants seems to be concerned with guiding us in what influences we choose to be open and responsive to. So here I find, I think, useful intersection with a number of modern day preoccupations, because on everybody's mind are words like, authenticity, right? I just spoke with somebody just this week who had decided to leave the church because they had to be true to their authentic selves. And I think that can be a dangerous myth, as if there is some kind of fixed identity that we are in search of. And I think Latter-day Saint theology suggests rather that identity is always a work in progress, and that we are always in a position to be making choices about the kind of identity we want to create. And the way we create an identity is by opening up ourselves to different influences. So to give a kind of simple, matter-of-fact example, let's say that I just intuit that the ability to appreciate Beethoven is a beautiful thing. That there's something refined, aesthetically and morally refined, about people who can go to a great concert and just fully absorb and appreciate it. Well, maybe I'm not one of those persons. I want to be. Well, what do I do then? I go to concerts. Yeah. So I open myself up to those influences that can work upon me, shape me, cultivate a responsiveness, a sensitivity on my part. Now, if we just extrapolate from that example to discipleship generally, it means that we're not searching to uncover some true self. We are deliberately and consciously aspiring to a self. I think when I was 16 years old, I read Proverbs for the first time, and that laid one of those verses, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 3, it laid the foundations for my own life of faith. And that was, if we act in particular ways, then God will establish our thoughts. So that to me was a powerful kind of formative idea that, I don't like home teaching. I'm antisocial. But if I just follow the prescription to do what is counseled and advised, then I'll let God take care of my disposition. And gradually that sociability and that selflessness and openness to others will become part of my nature. So I think that is the rubber meet the road essence of agency in the life of daily discipleship.
The scripture you're quoting here, commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established.
There you go.
Right? It's another proverb is just practice makes perfect. Once you're doing it, then it becomes the thing that you're putting your focus and your mind on.
Yeah, but it seems to me it's also a recognition of the fallacy, another one of these fallacies that we hear so frequently, which is, well, my heart isn't really in that, so it's not going to do me any good. And here we're being told, no, life is about the Mosaic law shaping us into a gospel people. And so it's okay if we're at a stage where we're just going through the motions. I think the proverb is saying that's okay. Yeah. Start with emotions and the inner man will be changed.
That does kind of flip it on its head for me, because I think even in my maybe a righteous pursuit of trying to become who I think I am meant to be, that implies that I'm lacking, or like there's some perfect version that I have not yet accomplished.
But you're not there. Yeah, exactly. It's out there and it's not me yet. And so I'm failing right now.
Yeah.
Right. And it makes me kind of think about the scriptures, actually. I think Cole and I talked about this recently in D&C 93. Even the Savior, he grew from grace to grace. That's how it's described. And that's the same way we learn, is growing from grace to grace. And that kind of is an interesting way to bring in agency there, because you're choosing to become who you're, quote, meant to be, but it's actually just perfecting yourself on your way to whatever version of that is.
Well, I think that whatever version is an important tale you just, because here again, I think as a people, my personal sense of Latter-day Saint culture is that we're still far more Calvinist than we should be, in that we assume there is this kind of prototype, this ideal self, and God is trying to direct us to that ideal self. So I love Brigham Young for one of his expostulations in the Tabernacle, where you could almost hear him shouting out, "Away with stereotyped Mormons! Away with stereotyped Mormons!" In other words, I think that agency is about acquiring greater individuality and differentiation, not greater commonality. And I think there's some remarkable moments in the Doctrine and Covenants, one in particular where Joseph is asking, so how many times do we have to suffer persecution before we can fight back? And it's a really remarkable answer the Lord gives him. He says, well, it's up to you. He said, suffer the first and suffer the second attack. If they come upon you a third time, well, you're justified if you want to go to war, and you're blessed if you don't. So it's like he's asking us, what kind of person do you want to be?
Interesting, yeah.
That's so, in an analogy I've invoked before, I don't think it's about getting the script right. I think God gives us a blank canvas and says, here, paint a beautiful picture. And I think he's, in many cases, anxious to see in what ways we can constitute a beautiful life that isn't conformed to an exact pattern.
There's a lot more it mattereth not sometimes than we give it credit for.
That's right. Like what? Like, Heavenly Father, tell me what I should major in.
Oh my goodness.
And he's saying, yeah, what do you want to be? What do you want to do?
That is like the core agency thing, right? If we do believe that we do have agency, then what does it really help us to just ask God and get a specific path down the path at every single junction? That means we didn't agent anything, did we?
Yeah, there's some, and here we get to what seemed to me some of the interesting edges of Latter-day Saint theology, where it seems to flirt with heresy. Well, it openly flirts with.
If you ask some Christians, yeah, we do that often.
But, Brigham Young was pretty emphatic about this. Maybe it was just his personal opinion in sermons, but he said God's purpose is to make us as independent in our sphere as he is in his. It's another way of saying that, a parent's job is to work himself out of a job. So Brigham Young was creating a paradigm in which the Holy Spirit tutors us, teaches us, it guides us. But the idea is that the values that it inspires us to cultivate are values that eventually have to become intrinsic to the self, so that we are increasingly acting out of a spontaneous goodness and virtue and beauty, rather than just always being this. That's why there's some of my fellow Latter-day Saints who love to use some of the Calvinist language of sacrificing our will, of
submission, things like that.
That's the word I'm looking for. Surrender. Just surrender yourself to the Spirit. Okay, I think I know what they're saying, but what I hear in those words is a kind of evacuating of our personality, and I don't think God ever asks for that. At least this is just personally more beautiful for me to think in terms of, no, I have to work hard to align my will in righteous ways, not to abdicate my will and be filled with somebody else's plans and designs and objectives, even if that other person is God. So I want to be available as an instrument, but I think he also wants us to develop in beautiful ways where we our will, our agency become magnified. They grow. They become more efficacious in shaping beautiful individuals.
How do you feel, Terryl, and forgive me if this question feels inappropriate, what about Nietzsche then? This sounds like God is dead almost. It sounds, I understand it and I get it, but can we kind of discuss that a bit? Because if I'm trying to align my will with God, that sounds like what we're not doing. It sounds like we're finding our own righteous will. Then why God anyway, right?
No, I think Brigham Young was imagining a distant future when we get to a point where the apron strings don't quite have the same role that they do. I envision an eternity in which I will always adore and worship and honor God.
That's beautiful.
But I think that Nietzsche Look, I like Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche is one of the most useful and beneficial provocateurs to Christian theology going for a couple of reasons. One, I don't know how much you want this podcast to become about Nietzsche. I'll take it and run with it. I love Nietzsche's idea about the will to power. I think he's right. I think that the most fundamental impulse in the human being is not, it's got all these negative connotations. He didn't mean the ability or to oppress others. The will to power, as I understand Nietzsche, just means the capacity to leave our imprint in the universe, to leave footprints in the sand, to say, I was here, I made choices, I altered the nature of reality by the exercise of choice. I wasn't just this passive rock on the seashore. And so I think he's right. And again, I think this aligns perfectly with Joseph Smith saying agency is the most fundamental principle of existence. Intelligence has to be able to act for itself, or there isn't even meaningful existence. That sounds very Nietzschean to me. Where Nietzsche goes wrong, I think, is in believing in the absolute autonomy and independence of the human agent. And I think, on the contrary, that agency is always interrelated. It's always interconnected. We should become increasingly interdependent in important, selfless, loving, compassionate ways. And there was no place for that kind of thing in Nietzsche's system.
That was an interesting thing, because you sort of brushed on this earlier as well when we were talking about the way that God influences and the idea that God may influence our agency or even limit at times. It may feel that way, but our circumstances in the world that we were born in and the people around us can also enhance or it feel like limit our agency in some ways as well. It's like society, governments, whatever it is, they all have a force on what our agency can be.
Thank you for raising those points, because those are terribly important points that I try to address in this volume.
Yeah.
And this is where modern developments in psychology especially, and even in sociobiology come into it. It turns out that the realm of human agency is continually diminishing at the hands of science. There are now over 100 different versions of cognitive bias that have been documented in any number of studies by cognitive science. You know, a cognitive bias is something like confirmation bias, right?
Yeah.
But as I said, there are over 100. You go to Wikipedia, look up the article on cognitive bias, over 100 examples. All of these cognitive biases are biases of which we are not aware. They are influences that exert a force upon us and shape our decision-making and our acting in ways we're not aware of. And so it seems that increasingly the domain of real moral independence is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so I think part of what discipleship requires is recognizing the relationship between developments in scientific understanding and our own doctrine and theology, right? We can't run from dinosaur bones. I hope we're not doing that anymore. Neither can we run from these kinds of developments that warn us that, look, there are influences at work on us that we're not aware of, and we're not as free as we thought. So I think we need to make room for that reality without sacrificing the flag. We still have to maintain emphatically that we are free to react and to respond, always within limitations. But that capacity to respond, I think, is what we need to be continually trying to enlarge. And so part of what the gospel does is it warns us away from the kinds of things that end up restricting our agency. Now, we've always talked about the obvious ones, like drug addiction and alcohol.
Addiction, yeah.
But
phone addiction nowadays, like
yeah. But now we've got the documentation that we didn't have before for the extent to which we are shaped by peers, by the kind of micro communities that we belong to, and by all kinds of background noise, just the white noise that's in the atmosphere. And so I think the gospel counsels and warnings and principles about the ways in which we open ourselves up to other influences are made even more relevant and urgent by the recognition of these encroachments on human agency that are around us.
It gives you a lot to chew on to think that this gift of agency that I don't know, is it fair to say we've been given this gift of agency, or it's always existed?
Well, that's a good question. Our version of the Pearl of Great Price says it was given to us, but the version that the reorganized church has says that it was always there. That's because when Brigham Young was approving the Pearl of Great Price for canonization and publication, he didn't want to work with a reorganized church, and they had the better manuscripts of the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis. So this is kind of, a very esoteric footnote, but it's not. It's really important that in Joseph's recounting of the story of the fall through the book of Moses, he changes his wording from God gave man his agency to man had his agency. And that's consistent with the Doctrine and Covenants, right? So I think what happens in the story of the Garden of Eden, literally or allegorically, is that God creates the conditions under which agency can be tried and tested and developed. I think this idea was there way back in Milton and his version of Paradise Lost, where one reading his parable is that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is a provocation. And I think this is the sermon of Lehi in 2 Nephi 2, where the opposition in all things, and right, the most quoted out of context scripture in our canon.
We were going to get there, yeah.
Right, he's talking about opposition in terms of cosmic alternatives. That there have to be alternatives for agency to be operative. That's God, I think, creates a world, conditions, influences a world that is just full of those kinds of alternatives, oppositions, and choices.
And what I was going to say is that whether it's that gift or that thing that's always existed, it's the way God operates within it. It seems what I'm hearing you say over and over again is it's merciful how God is letting us learn and choose and grow in this kind of environment. That opposition that exists, it's mercy to me.
Well, yes, absolutely. So this has been central to my work for the last 4 years. I've been working on my own version of a history of Christianity, in which I'm trying to answer in Latter-day Saint inflected ways, where did Christianity go wrong? I think we talk about all kinds of window dressing details. Well, the baptism should be by immersion, not sprinkling, or this, right? That stuff is just details. But fundamentally, I think that Jesus' incarnation, and I think John is emphatic on this point, the incarnation was to show us who God really is. That doesn't sound like a history remaking proposition, but I think it was. We didn't know God. We didn't know him fully. He wasn't in fleshly form. We didn't see him acting. We didn't see him engaged in our lives, in the struggle of human existence. Right? We see him, we touch him, we feel him, we hear him, he weeps, he laughs. Now we know who God is. And the one thing that we learned about God that was paramount above all others is that he only works by love. Time and time and time again, not just in John, but in all the evangelists, Christ is depicted as explicitly repudiating prevalent power structures and ways of exerting control. And he's trying to turn these paradigms upside down, right? The first shall be last. Doesn't matter if you come at 9 o'clock or 5 o'clock, I'm going to pay you the same. You stay in jail, you'll pay the uttermost farthing according to this world's legal system, not according to mine. To the woman in adultery, go thy way and sin no more. Love looks forward, not backward. So there are all of these ways that become articulated, I think, most powerfully in section 121, where we're told no power, influence can or be maintained by virtue of the priesthood. I think we still haven't gotten that lesson. That's pretty clear, emphatic, definitive language there. There is no principle of power that God recognizes or operates by, except for love. So what our challenge is, it seems to me, is to just learn to respond to that love.
To use our agency.
That's where our agency comes directly into play. We choose how we respond to that love and how we emulate that love. how we receive agents of love and how we become agents of love.
It sounds like Mosiah 3:19, to put off the natural man and to become like God.
That's right.
And that's a beautiful, wow, I'm excited to hear more about what you're creating and writing out right now.
Well, I do think that what happens to love, as I've tried to burrow into this and see exactly when and where and how and by whom does love become deformed. Just to note parenthetically, Tom Holland, great historian of Christianity, said, when love is unmoored from its theological foundations, moral anarchy results. That's kind of the theme of my whole project, is that once, and this starts really in the late 4th, early 5th century, when a number of important voices start saying, well, God's justice doesn't look like our justice, and God's love doesn't look like our love. Well, if that's the case, then yeah, you can perpetrate religious warfare, you can hold inquisitions, you can burn people at the stake, you can damn infants and say, well, that's God's love. We don't understand God's love. And so once God's love becomes disconnected from the human experience of love, Christianity goes off the rails. I think time and time again that happens. And we can go off the rails. And you can go off the rails, it seems to me, in either direction by making love this legalistic, right, highly constrained thing, which is, right, well, we all know what that looks like.
Yeah.
Go to the other extreme, which is, well, love means anything you want it to mean. And so there are no constraints and no rigor to it. And I think we have to find that middle road. And I think Jesus' whole project was to say, no, God's love looks like this. And then he shows us. And it's the love that we practice and aspire to and weekly imitate.
Thank you for bringing this all back to love, because I think doctrinally, it can be easy to get lost and to remember to keep Christ and his mercy and what his sacrifice and choices have done for us in our own path on this life, and how we can exercise your agency. So, Terryl Givens, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for asking. Good question.
Agency. Themes in the Doctrine and Covenants is the latest in a series of themes that are being published by Deseret Book this year. We've already had a couple of those conversations, and so you can go back and check some of our previous podcast episodes, and you have something to look forward to as you continue your Come Follow Me study this year. We thank Terryl Givens once again for his time and preparation. He was wonderful. And we thank you for listening to this latest episode of Out of the Best Books, where we take down a book from the Deseret Book Library and let it inspire conversation. That's what we did today. We'll see you next time.